Hey, Ryan, we have some pretty exciting news, I think. Construction Disruption now has our first ever paid sponsor. There's this company that approached us about getting in front of our audience, and we're so pleased to have them now as a sponsor.
That's right, Todd. That company is TrueLook, and what they offer is pretty awesome. They've made it incredibly easy to view, secure, and document job sites with their construction cameras.
A lot of times I think we think of construction cameras as, just being there for security. But with TrueLook, they also have features like custom time-lapse videos and remote live viewing.
Yeah, a term we throw around a lot here on Construction Disruption is game changing, and TrueLook certainly falls into that category. Being able to document your progress on job sites and then go back and show your clients that high quality in progress video is certainly something that I would call game changing.
I absolutely agree. And at TrueLook, they also have unlimited users, free forever media storage, 24/7 support, no contract service plans, lifetime equipment warranties, and no limits on 4G LTE data transmission.
And they integrate seamlessly with project management tools like Procore and Autodesk.
I don't think anyone makes construction cameras as hassle-free or feature-rich as TrueLook. Anyone can go and schedule a free, no-obligation quote at truelook.com. That's truelook.com.
Welcome to the Construction Disruption Podcast, where we uncover the future of design, building, and remodeling.
I'm Todd Miller of Isaiah Industries, manufacturer of specialty metal roofing and other building materials. Today, my co-host is Ryan Bell. Ryan, welcome to this episode of Construction Disruption. You doing well?
Hey, good morning, Todd. I am doing great. How are you?
Doing great as well. I want to thank you for filling in. As you know, Seth Heckerman was actually supposed to co-host, but he was playing peekaboo with his young daughters and had a horrible accident. And we appreciate you filling in for him. He is in the ICU now. Okay, that one just went over really, really well, didn't it? Oh, okay.
We just need the little sound pads with so everyone knows when the joke has dropped.
Well, Ryan was entirely supposed to be the co-host from day one, so thank you for joining us today.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm excited. Today, I think this is the first time we've had a repeat guest on the show. Am I mistaken on that? Is that your recollection too?
I believe it is. I tried to think back and I cannot think of. I know we've talked about it before, but I can't think of any time we've actually had a repeat guest on.
Well, I'm excited because you're right. We've talked about it, and here we are coming up close on our 100th episode at this point. And yeah, we've got a few more I know I've talked to and said, we'll have you on again sometime. But this episode, our guest won out in that race to be our first repeat guest. So today we have back Andrew Olsen of DickersonBakker. He was our guest way back on episode 66. And in that episode, we talked about his work in the professional fundraising business, and in particular, how that has taught him how to reach people through emotion. But today, he wanted to join us, and we quickly picked up on it, to have him delve into the very personal story of him growing up the son of a father who was addicted to gambling, and the devastating impact that had on his family, but then also painting that picture of hope and restoration. But through that pain he went through, all that when he was younger and in his family, Andrew has developed a great understanding of really how God uses those painful experiences to prepare us for our futures. So it's a real blessing to have him here today to tell his story. Andrew, welcome back to Construction Disruption.
Hey, thanks, Todd. Thanks, Ryan. I'm really excited to be here. I'm glad to be able to share with your audience and hope that what we're going to talk about helps to bring some perspective and hope to others if they're struggling or had similar challenges in their lives. So really appreciate you guys giving us a platform for this.
Well, and we love doing that. I mean, a lot of our episodes we're really into the weeds, looking at construction and design and architecture. But every once in a while, we kind of step back and realize that, hey, we're all people here, and we all have stuff that we deal with, and we all have stuff that we're trying to figure out sometimes. And we love to be of help and give everyone sort of maybe a fresh perspective, but also a fresh way of caring for one another as well by sometimes getting a better understanding of the shoes that others are walking in. So, Andrew, you had reached out to me a while back and sent me a video of you sharing really this very deeply personal and emotional story. You had shared it in that case at an Association for Christian fundraising event. Would love it if you could just kind of retell that story about what happened within your family, and then we'll kind of go on and unpack it a little bit.
For sure. So yeah, the video that I sent you and the story that I was telling, I've sort of crafted the narrative around this idea of finding purpose in our pain, right? And so what I shared with them is the story of growing up. I grew up in Southern California, the Los Angeles area, the son of two high school sweethearts. My mom and dad got married while they were still in high school, and my father was a congregational minister, and my mom was mostly worked as a teacher's assistant at a school in Southern California. And when I was just about 15. My father went to Alaska. It was a really weird decision. He said, there's this church in Alaska, and I think that we're being called up there. I think that I'm gonna take a job up there. So he went on this trip to go talk to these folks in Alaska about taking a church up there. And I was kind of like, well, wait a minute, we live in Los Angeles. What in the world why would we ever go to a place like Alaska, right? And so while he was gone, one morning, 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the morning, something like that, we're all getting ready for school and work, and there was a knock on our front door. And I went to the door, opened the door, and there were a couple of sheriff's deputies standing on the other side of the door. And we lived in a rough neighborhood. I mean, we didn't have a lot of money, and so we were in a pretty poverty-ridden community. It was not uncommon for cops to show up on our street. In fact, the day we moved in, there was a raid on the house across the street. So we were familiar with, law enforcement presence, but they'd never shown up at our house, right? And so I called my mom and brought her to the door, and I could just see on the look on these guys' faces, they were not excited to be there, right? This was not a fun conversation for them. And so what they did was they reached in and handed her a document, and they said, ma'am, this is an eviction notice. You've got 3 days to vacate this property. And come to find out that we hadn't paid our mortgage in 14 months. And notice after notice had been sent, but nothing had been done with them. And so, she crumpled to the floor. She was devastated. And they left and just kind of left us there to process that information. What we ended up finding out is that my father knew that eviction notice was coming, that the deputies were on their way, and he fled essentially so that he didn't have to face them, and he didn't have to face us, and so we started to unravel and uncover this secret that he had kept for years, where he had a gambling addiction that started years ago, and he would actually leave our house in the morning, tell us he was going to work, go to the Burbank airport in Southern California, fly to Las Vegas, spend the day in Vegas gambling, and then fly home at night, come home, plop down, and be like, oh man, such a hard day at work, so much going on, when in reality he was out, burning through our family savings and all the money that we had to care for ourselves, and keeping that secret, And so he knew they were coming. He left to avoid that and left us holding the bag, if you will. My mom and I and my little brother and sister, a couple days later, ended up packing our car with everything we could and leaving. Right? I mean, what else do you do when they tell you we're taking your house? And he had my father had opened a PO box so that all of the bills, all of the late notices, all of the eviction paperwork would go somewhere else, and none of us would have any idea about it. So it was a complete shock when they did show up. We ended up for a time staying at my grandparents' house, only to find out that my grandmother was actually enabling my father's addiction and sending him money. And in that process, he ended up wiping out my grandparents' entire savings and leaving them destitute and homeless as a result as well. We then later discovered that he stole tens of thousands of dollars from multiple churches that he had pastored. And we had, church leaders and members coming to us telling us they wanted their money back. We ended up effectively homeless, couch surfing with friends, struggling to figure out how do you pay to, a rent anywhere, to, we were living in motels for a while. I remember a situation where, we walked into a grocery store and my little brother wanted a hot meal and we didn't have any way to cook it. And he started just crying because he said, I just want hot food tonight, Mama. And she slapped him. My mom smacked him, and not because she wasn't trying to abuse him or anything, but she was just so stressed out and so personally devastated by hearing that she couldn't care for what he wanted, that she just broke. I remember standing in line in the LA County Welfare Office thinking like, wow, 30 days ago, like we were solidly middle class. We had a decent house. We had 2 cars. We could afford to go out to lunch or whatever, and all the things that you think about when you think of somebody who's a decent wage earner. And now today we're standing here in line for food stamps because we don't have any other way to make ends meet. And it was just such a like crushing blow, right? And trying to understand why on earth something like that happens. What triggers that kind of behavior in someone, that they would put everything that they have at risk and lie and cheat and steal to feed that addiction, right? And I was 15. I didn't understand anything about addiction at that point, right? Come to find out later that actually like 75% of my family on both sides have addictive personalities, and were, whether it was drugs or alcohol or gambling, it's a lot more prevalent in the world than I think many of us realize. And, so I ended up at 16 leaving home. I left and just decided, if I take one mouth out of the house, it's going to be easier for my mom to take care of my brother and sister. So I went and slept. I stayed with a friend and slept on a concrete floor in their house for as long as they'd let me. And they were gracious and allowed me to do that to make my way through high school and actually finish school, because otherwise I would have effectively ended up on the street, right? But it was devastating and such a struggle for so long. I mean, it really just put our family on a completely different path than I ever expected. And I, even in that though, I do remember times where I thought, I grew up in the church. My father was a pastor, but everything he did made me wonder, like, is this legit? Or was this all a lie too? Right? Because I clearly can't trust him as a father, so why would I trust him as a pastor, But then things would happen that would sort of remind me that there's forces bigger than me in this world, right? So as an example, we'd be down to our last $10, right? And I know that there was no way that we could put gas in the car, buy food for the family for the week, pay the bill that was late that we needed to pay, and do all of those things with the last $10 or $15 that we had. And then on that day, my mom would find a note in her locker at work with $100 gift card to the grocery store, right? Or I started working at 15 at a pizza joint just so that I could help make ends meet. The owner of the pizza joint would come in and be like, "Hey, somebody bought 2 pizzas and never showed up to pick them up. So here, why don't you take these home?" He had no idea what was going on in our house, right? But it was those kind of little things that started to show me that, like, for as much as I am angry and not trusting and just don't know what to believe anymore, that even in those situations, God was at work taking care of us. Not maybe in the way that I would have wanted or expected, not fixing the situation, but making it so that we could get through that day, right? And it took a long time for me to really kind of crystallize and realize that that's what it was. At the time, it was just like, oh, thank God, we're able to eat today, right? Or wow, now we can actually put that money in the gas tank, and mom can get to work so that she doesn't lose her job, right? But with the benefit of hindsight and being able to look back now, I can see that in all of those instances, when we were willing to call on him, he was there for us, right? Even though I might not have thought about it that way when I was a kid. And this went on for, well, gosh, I was 15 when it happened, and they were still struggling through this when I was in college. Again, one of the odd blessings that we had, my father with his addiction and everything and being kicked out of his leadership roles at church. One interesting thing was there was a college in Northeast Georgia that is affiliated with the Congregational Church, and they said to me, even though your father's essentially been removed from leadership in the church since you were a pastor's kid for 18 years, you can come here on scholarship. So I ended up getting a completely free education because of that profession that he had, even in spite of the fact that he violated many oaths and everything that happened there. They still sort of extended that grace to me, if you will. And this is just another example of God really watching out for us and setting things in motion that I didn't have the context to process at the time. But I walked out of a 4-year degree with zero debt. In fact, I had net dollars in my pocket at the end of my 4 years because they also paid for my books and I could sell them back, right? So, I mean, how many people get to tell a story like that and get to have that kind of thing happen, even in the midst of everything else that I'm sharing with you, right? My parents divorced when I was in college. But then some things happened that actually sort of changed the story around, right? So I thought that our family would just kind of, descend into oblivion and we would never talk, right? I didn't talk to my father for 15 years. I barely talked to my mother for pretty much the same amount of time, right? Just because he had made his choices and she was struggling to keep the family together. And so she was making decisions to sort of try to reconnect with him. And it was the right thing for her to do in her marriage. I just didn't understand it back then. But I saw that as her choosing him, a liar, a gambler, a cheat, over us, right? So I just said, you know what, I'm out, I'm done. And it took about 15 years for us to even start talking again. And what happened in those intervening years is he got clean and sober, and hadn't gambled for about 11 years. They actually remarried one another. I got a call from my younger sister while I was away, and she said, "Hey, mom and dad are got married today." And I said, "Well, to whom did they get married? Like, and why did they pick the same day?" And she started laughing. She's like, "No, shut up! Like, they got remarried together, right?" And so their relationship was restored. And then my father actually went and got a counseling degree, and ended up spending the last he's passed away a couple years ago now, but the last probably 10 years of his life he spent counseling other gambling addicts and working with state gambling associations to help build programs to intervene when people have unhealthy behaviors around gambling and addictive behaviors. And so I mean, he and I, when he passed, we were on probably the best terms we were ever going to be on, given everything that had happened. I still wish it had been better. But at least at the end of the day, we were able to tell each other that we loved each other. Do I wish I had a better relationship with him? Absolutely. But knowing that, all that reconciliation had happened before he passed, and the recovery in his life, and the reconnection with my mom, I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff to see happen. Particularly when really kind of all trust had been blown apart early on in their marriage. And so it's actually now that I look back on it this way, I think there is, some really just beautiful change that happened in their lives. My mom's actually going to be here on my farm next week. She now comes and visits fairly regularly, gets to see the grandkids and spend time with them. So we've been rebuilding that relationship and kind of reconnecting. And just the idea that even in the midst of all that baggage that he and she had, they're able to reconnect with one another, and then to use their experiences to help others who are having similar challenges, and help keep marriages together, help rebuild marriages that have been destroyed because of trust issues around addiction, and then to also help addicts that are actively engaged or considering going back into a casino or going online to gamble, and to help them keep from doing that, to be able to protect their lives and their families. That's pretty impactful, and then, for me personally, I went into this career of fundraising 25 years ago, not really thinking like, hey, I'm on a mission here. And it took me a good 10 or 15 years to realize that what I had gone through was actually setting me up to do this work really well. And the way that I think about that, most of my time in the last 25 years has been spent serving people who live in poverty, right? So whether it's working for a food pantry, or a homeless shelter, or the Salvation Army, or even a global poverty program, I feel like the calling that I'm following is to alleviate suffering anywhere that I can do that, right? And that's not some grandiose, like I'm a savior or anything like that. I'm talking about, doing the small things that move the needle a little bit, making sure that families have, the money they need to put food on the table, to put gas in the gas tank to get to work, to be able to, buy their kid a pair of shoes when they need them, those kind of things, right? I'm not trying to make something bigger of myself than I am. But what the context that's really valuable and took me a long time to learn is that all of those experiences, all of the suffering that we went through as kids and that my parents went through, really helped to shape how I think about people and what it means to be someone who says, yeah, okay, I think I can help fix that problem. I can't solve the whole crisis, right? I can't solve global poverty, but can I help intervene so that one person doesn't have to suffer the way they are right now? And I had no context for that, really kind of before letting this all sink in and processing through it for years. But I can see clearly now all these different experiences that we went through. We're setting up a scenario where now I can use the skills that I've been given, to actually help other people who are facing similar crises, right? And I was listening to John Maxwell, who's for those of you who don't know, he's one of the kind of famed leadership gurus in the country, and he said this phrase that just like brought me to my knees. He said, "What we see as setbacks in our lives, God often uses as setups for something better," right? And I just stopped in my tracks and I was like, oh my gosh, that explains everything for me, right?
Yeah.
And so all of these things that I had struggled with, I such anger and resentment and frustration for everything that I'd went through with my father, all of a sudden, contextually, it's not to say that like it all went away that day. Like, when you've gone through trauma like that, you still deal with it every day. And, sometimes I still drop back into feeling sorry for myself and being grumpy about, childhood and things like that. But all of those things started to fall into place in a way where I could see, these aren't all negatives. They might have hurt in the moment, but they really created a framework for me, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, where I could then do something with that experience that brought a positive benefit to other people across the globe. And so, I am now kind of fully embracing and on this mission to help other people acknowledge and see how the pain that they've experienced can be purposeful and how they can actually create something impactful and valuable for others out of those experiences. And it doesn't have to be something that you just wallow and suffer in.
That's a powerful story, Andrew. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm sure every time you share it, even though you've done it a lot, it has to bring back a lot of emotions. As you were sharing, I jotted a number of questions I wanted to delve into a little bit, and in fact, jotted so many I ran out of ink in my pen. So now I'm writing with a magic marker I found. But I'm kind of curious. And I realized you were pretty young at the time, but as you look back on your father's ministry, did he have a heart for those who were dealing with addictions and struggling with things that came out in his ministry while he was dealing with it himself?
I think he did. So a couple years after all this came out, I was sitting with my grandfather, his father, and I kind of asking him questions about, my dad's childhood and his teenage years, and just sort of like, hey, did you ever see this coming? Right? Was there a warning sign that we should have red flag have gone off anywhere? Right? And my grandfather said that when my father was in college, he took all of his college semester, payment money one semester and bought drugs with it. And so he ended up getting kicked out of college, and it was kind of through that process that he then came to faith. And my grandfather tells a story where I guess my father said something, prayed some prayer similar to, God, if you just get me out of this, I'll commit the rest of my life to serving you and to ministering in your name. And so that's, essentially kind of how he came into ministry. And I think, in many ways, he did have a desire to help people who were dealing with addictive behaviors, but for so long he was just so deep into his own addiction that he wasn't able to be effective at it.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Well, your whole family and the John Maxwell quote is great. I mean, I've heard that a lot. A setback is a setup for a comeback, and God works in that way. I'm curious. For anyone out there who might be struggling, do you know anything about your dad's process for, getting clean and sober, as you say, what his process? I mean, he was dealing with homelessness, I'm sure, also at the same time. Do you know anything about that process, or would you have any great words of advice for somebody out there who might be dealing with addictive behavior in their own life, whatever that might be, as far as how they get out of those
Absolutely.
chains?
So, couple things, and yes, he ended up living in his car for a while after he left us to go to Alaska. So there was homelessness too. I would say a couple things. First of all, his process. He entered a Gamblers Anonymous program. So like Alcoholics Anonymous, like Narcotics Anonymous, similar type program, and then also sought out a counselor to help him kind of on a one-on-one process. But I would say in every zip code in the United States, the Salvation Army runs programs for addiction recovery, right? So there's not a city, there's not an unincorporated county, there's not a town, there's not a holler anywhere in this country where the Salvation Army doesn't have a program to help people who are struggling with addiction. So they're one great place to go. I would also say, there's a group called Teen Challenge. They teen is in their name, but they work with adults too. They also have a global network of counselors and programs for people who are dealing with addiction. Another option might not sound common because a lot of people who face addiction aren't dealing with homelessness, but there is a network called CityGate. And those folks run addiction recovery programs for alcohol, drugs, gambling, pornography, really any addiction that you might face. They often are inside homeless shelters, but they're also great referral partners for other programs. Those are some big ones. Local hospitals almost always have a partner that deals with addiction recovery programs. So many churches also have these programs now. I mean, this is one of those things, and I learned this with my dad. Like, just because you have a particular faith, maybe you go to church every Sunday, doesn't mean that you're not going to face addiction too, right? So I think there are a lot of different programs like that, and I know that one of the stories that we tell ourselves when we're dealing with something like this is that we're alone. No one can know about this. There's so much shame tied up in dealing with the aftermath of addiction, and I think that's a false narrative that is used to destroy people, right? And so you don't have to face these kind of things alone. And often the best way to start down the road of recovery is to talk to somebody else about it, even if it's not a quote unquote licensed professional. If you've got a friend, a family member, somebody at a local civic group or church that you trust, just start having a conversation and ask for help.
Would that be your same advice for someone? I mean, look at yourself. You weren't the one who was in the addictive behavior, but yet you went through, and so did your mom and your siblings went through these very traumatic times. And my story's nothing, like yours, but, we all have a story. And I remember in particular when my father passed away a few years ago, and we had a decent relationship. We worked together, but after he passed away, I dealt with nightmares for months that just seemed to come out of nowhere. But it helped me realize that there was stuff from my childhood I had never really dealt with, and now all of a sudden, with his passing, it triggered a lot of that. But any advice for somebody out there who maybe went through a tough time and they find themselves at a point where they're thinking, maybe haven't dealt with that fully, or maybe I haven't dealt with that in the most healthy way. And, sometimes that can force somebody into addictive behavior too, to boot.
It
But
sure can. Yeah.
any advice for folks in those shoes?
Yeah. I mean, it can push people into addictive behavior or just dangerous behaviors, right? So
Sure.
I think talking about it is really important, right? The more that we bottle things up, the worse they get. So journaling, talking to a friend or a loved one, or even someone that's not closely connected, because oftentimes we say, oh well, if this person who loves and respects me knew about this, they wouldn't love and respect me anymore, right? It's not true, but it's the story that we tell ourselves. So sometimes maybe you just need to find someone who's a little bit further removed, whether it's a therapist or a lot of companies in their insurance programs will have these kind of helplines that you can call and you can talk to someone, and they can offer you resources for support and things like that. Something like that might even be helpful. I've seen a lot of people do, kind of their own processing through journaling and recording, their thoughts and things like that. Certainly, therapy or some sort of group counseling, kind of like, I know that all the Alcoholic Anonymous and programs like that usually have one for family members as well, which I know my mom was a part of, and those were really helpful for her. And then I think the other thing that I've found is the more that we can do something for someone else, the better we can gain perspective on our own issues, right? So I find sometimes that the best way for me to get out of my own funk when I'm feeling sorry for myself is to go out and serve somebody else, right? So whether that's volunteering, whether that's, going to mow your neighbor's lawn or take your neighbor's grandma to do her grocery shopping, whatever it might be. If you seek ways to help other people, that there's actually science behind it. Like it increases your endorphins, it increases oxytocin.
Sure.
It does things that give you a positive emotional feeling, and also gets you to stop focusing on the negative. So I think that's a great way to, even just in the moment, kind of get a reset. And then I think the thing that has really been important to me is really deeply thinking about and trying to understand how do I use what I experienced to do something better in the world, right? And regardless of what kind of work you do or anything like that, like we all have these experiences. Many people go through something traumatic. How do we take those things and turn them into a positive rather than just wallowing in the negative?
It's interesting. I know, over the years, I've gained a lot of perspective on, things I had gone through in my childhood, simply by hearing other people's stories also. And, it helped me realize, hey, I'm not alone. And these people have gotten through some very difficult things as well. And good stuff. Well, I'm kind of curious. I mean, we fast forward to today, and you're a husband and father, and great story about your mom coming and being with her grandkids at your farm and that type of stuff. Is there any ways that you think you approach life as a husband and father differently because of what you went through and because of that story that God has built into your life? Has that impacted, how you play those roles in your life?
It has for sure, and some positive, some not so positive, right? Um,
Hmm.
for example, I remember when my wife and I were dating and getting serious and talking about marriage. I remember a conversation where I said to her, I don't want to have children until we own a home, because I can count 16 houses I lived in a 4-year period, because we were moving so often because we couldn't pay rent, that I don't want a chance that the kids we have are going to come be raised in an environment like that, right? um, I I work my butt off, right? So I have a thriving career in the fundraising industry, and then I own 2 other businesses, and I do that because we went without so often, that I have just this deep fear that if I don't hustle, we're not going to be okay, right? And I know that that's not healthy, and I know that
Right.
that's there's dysfunction in it, but it's just a reality for me, right? That I understand that my priority for the family is to make sure they're cared for, and so I've set this structure up to do that, right? But then in addition to that, now my kids all, if I brought them in here right now, and I said to them, "Do you know I love you?" They'd say, "Oh my gosh, would you stop telling us that?" Right? And I do that because I didn't hear it a lot from my dad as a kid, right? He was so
Right.
focused on himself that he just, we were sort of disconnected even when he was in the home. So I try to make a point, multiple times throughout the day, to pull my kids aside and to tell them, you're important to me. I love you,
Beautiful.
and not because you did this, but just because you're my child, right? um, in my marriage, it's taken a long time to get healthier. So my parents fought a lot, right? And I saw, I mean, it wasn't uncommon to have plates thrown across the room. I remember an ironing board flying across the room once. I mean, stuff like that, right? So I came into our marriage relationship kind of unwilling to fight, because I had seen the negative, the way that it could devolve, right? So when we would have an argument, I'd just be like, okay, whatever. Like, I mean, if it's not something that was a massive issue, I just let it go, right? Because I was like, well, I don't want to fight about it, because that's how you start throwing plates and ironing boards, and I don't want that in this house. And it, a couple years in, my wife and I had a fairly significant argument, and she said, look, when you just disengage and don't fight, that makes me think that you don't think I'm worth fighting for. And I was like, gosh, it's just the opposite. I was trying not to fight so I didn't, ruin this, right? But hearing that and understanding that, now we have a much healthier kind of back and forth and a push pull in those conversations. That's, nobody throws anything. But we have more robust, arguments and discussions and dialogue. And I hope and think that now she understands that, yeah, I do think our relationship's worth fighting for. But because of the way what I experienced as a kid, I just was scared to death that if I did fight, it would end in us, completely separating, right? So things like that still come up almost every day, and I do my best to, make sure that I'm creating more positives on the board for them than negatives. Doesn't always work out that way in the moment, but that's kind of the goal.
You remind me of a story. So I guess this is personal sharing time here today. I don't know, but I grew up with a father who had a very quick temper, and he was a very ugly man when he was angry. Also, and I remember one time when my wife and I were or high school sweethearts. One time when we were dating, something tripped my trigger, and I showed a little bit of that anger, and fortunately saw it in myself and, quickly said, Todd, you're sitting here with the best thing you've ever had in your life. You are not going to let this mess it up. And, and I said, I'm not going to let that happen again. And I'm going to figure out how to deal with conflict and things in healthy ways. And, and fortunately through the grace of God, I don't think I have let that hair trigger anger show again. But by the same token, yeah, I mean, there's still times I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do you deal with conflict in healthy ways? And that can be a challenge. So all of that stuff stems out of our childhood so much, no doubt about
absolutely.
it. I kind of want to go back a tiny bit. When you're talking about the story of, when you're homeless and, when this all first started to come down in your family, and now you can look back and you can see, the saving grace of God. You can see his provision. You can see what he built into you to bring you to where you are today. That's tough to see when you're actually in it, though. And you had that faith background to try to help you to see it. But still, it's got to be, when you're in the thick of it, you're just worried about surviving, don't you think? Or can people actually see God when they're in the midst of that sort of trial?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I think the answer is yes all around, right? I mean, I remember, like it was yesterday, the negatives, right? So I can recall a time that, I walked in, it was probably like 2 o'clock in the morning, and my mom was just like sitting at the kitchen table bawling, in this little apartment that we were renting. And the reason she was upset was that we didn't have any food in the house to feed my brother and sister dinner, right? And so she put them to bed without dinner, and they were cranky and crying and, asking why. And then she knew that, oh gosh, 8 hours from now when they wake up, I'm just going to have the same conversation with them again. Right. And, so I don't feel like you see any hope in that. Right. But at the same time, the very next day, 2 days later, whatever it was one of those situations where there was just a bag of groceries in her locker at work when she showed up in the morning. And so, I know that she was praying every day, and it was probably a very simple prayer of like, God, just let us get through today kind of thing. Right. And so I think, if you are open to looking and to seeing those things, I think they are there, and there are indicators. But at the same time, sometimes things are so bad that you just like you get this, sort of myopic view, like you're looking through, a scope ring on a rifle, right? You see only what's in the scope ring, and you don't see everything that's outside that. And so, if you're not looking and scanning and saying, okay, well, yes, this sucks, and what else is going on around me, right? I think so often it's really easy to get stuck in the, yeah, this sucks, and just really kind of let yourself wallow in it. And it's just human nature, right? It's we're wired to, kind of get focused in on something and not necessarily take a step back and consider everything else that's going on around us. There were plenty of times when, we'd have $100 in the bank account and the washer or the dryer would go out, right? And we had bought the washer and the dryer at a thrift store. We had only paid $100 for them. So I'm like, okay, great. Now I got to spend another $100 to repair this. And $100, at that point in our lives, that might be, 2 weeks worth of work, right? There's no way to turn around and pay for those sort of things. And so we just literally would be like, okay, well, maybe we're just going to have to go with dirty clothes for the next month or two until we can figure this out, or things like that. And so it's hard to see in those moments that that there's, A, that there's a God, and B, that he has a plan that's working out there. And so I think, for a lot of these instances, it's a lot easier for me to see it now, right? And when I look back now, I can go, oh, I see exactly how those things line up. In the moment, it was almost exclusively sort of a how do we survive, not even a how do we thrive, just a how do we get through this kind of thing.
So one of the things I struggle with a lot is, okay, I'm talking to somebody who's going through a difficult time. What do you say to them? Because you want to plant that seed of hope, but yet you don't want to discount what they're going through. You don't want to seem trite. I really appreciate your wisdom, so I'm throwing all these tough questions at you. But
Yeah.
What do you say to someone?
I mean, I don't know that I have the answer on that. I think, in part, it's just sort of like being present with them,
Right.
I was talking to a really good friend of mine earlier this week who's had two deaths in her close community in the last couple of months, and she was asking, what do I say to this husband whose wife passed away and whose child passed away? Like, how do I even bring comfort? And I said, I think at some point it might just be about being present while they process their grief, right? You don't necessarily have to be the expert who's saying all the things. It might just be about coming alongside them and saying, I know this is terrible. I don't have words that are going to make this better, but I will be here with you until you don't need me anymore, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. I think there's a lot of value in not saying, how can I help you? Right now, I think oftentimes people are like, well, but that's how you be helpful, right? But when you think about the fact that, like, gosh, I'm going through this terrible thing, the last thing I want to do is sit here and brainstorm how you can help me, right? So, when we were in the thick of crisis, what was most helpful was someone just showing up and saying, hey, I'm going to mow your lawn so you don't have to think about that. Or, hey, I brought a pizza over for the kids. Can I just leave this here and you guys do what you need? Or my good friends who said, hey, you got stuff going on that's making it impossible for you to live at home. Why don't you come stay with us, right? That took the emotional and mental energy off of me having to figure out the solution to tell them to then help me. So I think, it's often well intentioned for people to say, how can I help you? But that might not be the most effective way. I think sometimes it's just about saying, I've identified some things, and unless you tell me not to, I'm going to do these things, right?
Yeah, I that's great advice, and I love it. And I think guys in particular sometimes have to draw themselves back to do that because we kind of grow up with this. We can fix anything. I'm Bob the Builder. I can fix it. Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Sort of mentality, and so sometimes it takes a lot of extra for us to pull back and say, okay, I can't fix this. I'm going to look disingenuous if I try to fix this, but how can I help? How can I make things a smidge easier for them right at this
Yeah,
moment?
I would agree. I think you teetered on another topic too, right? Like, uh, we as men are so bad at talking about our feelings and our emotions. and the rates of addiction and suicide are so high for men because of that. And so, I think part of the mission I'm on here, and the reason I'm even talking about this kind of stuff, is because the reality of letting negative emotions and trauma fester are that, people are leaving this world earlier than they should, and making eternal decisions because of short-term pain, and it doesn't have to be that way. And so it is incredibly difficult for many men, myself included, to have these kind of authentic, painful conversations. But if we don't, we're just making things worse on ourselves. And so I think platforms like this and other places where we can gather for real conversations, and to just be able to say, yeah, day sucks today. I just need some space, or can I talk to you about this? I mean, if we don't have that, I think the results are pretty disastrous.
You're right. They can be absolutely devastating. And it's interesting you brought that up, because before you joined us, we were just kind of planning out a future episode we're going to have where we'll have someone that talks a lot about suicide awareness and things. So perfect,
Yeah.
perfect setup for that episode coming forward. Well, this has been just so helpful, and thank you so much for sharing. I don't want to lose sight of, can you remind our audience what you do for your career, in
Yeah.
case there's anybody out there that you might be able to help?
Yeah. So I do a couple of things. I'm the senior vice president of fundraising solutions at a firm called DickersonBakker. So what we do is we help churches, ministries, and other 501c3 and C4 nonprofit organizations with two different things. We help them raise revenue to accomplish their mission, and we recruit talented people to serve in their organizations. And so, day to day, that's most of what I do. And then I also I'm an investor in a promotional marketing business where things like T-shirts and hats and caps and all that kind of stuff. And my family and I also run a family farm where we raise livestock and provide high quality protein to the community, and we are also trying to use that to raise three healthy kids and make sure that they stay well adjusted.
Well, this has been great. I feel certain your story is going to help someone and someone's out there in our
So
audience. We're close to wrapping up what we call the business end of things. Is there anything we haven't covered today that you'd like to share?
just that no matter how bad it feels today, there's hope, and you don't have to go through things alone. It just takes one act of raising your hand, and you don't have to suffer in silence.
Powerful. Thank you. Well, to kind of switch to a little bit of a lighter area here, I'm going to ask you, and you did this last time you were on the show, if you're willing to participate in our what we call rapid fire questions.
Let's do
This
it.
is kind of old hat to you.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Ryan, you want to alternate asking questions?
Sure, I would be glad to. Do you want me to go first?
I'll let you go first.
Okay, sounds good. Question number one, what product have you purchased that was a game changer for you? Sort of like a where have you been all my life moment.
I think so. I'm sitting down right now, but I bought a Costco electronic standing like variable desk. It's the best $250 investment I've made in the last 5 years.
Awesome. What do you like about it? Just the fact it allows the blood to flow and lets you change position and
That and what I find is when I stand up, I kind of fidget a little bit, and like my body just like my feet move a little bit, my arms move a little more, and I because of that I'm able to focus more. Like I find that when I move my body, my brain kind of keys in. So right now I'm sitting because I did a lot of farm work a couple days ago. My back's hurting, but usually when I'm standing, I'm able to just get a lot more done and be really focused.
cool. Very neat.
Do you how often do you switch from up to down? Like is it usually in one position
Couple
or
times during the day.
okay.
Yeah. Like I might spend the first 4 hours standing and then sit for an hour or so and then go back up.
Cool. I've gone back and forth and I've found with a actual like a not a desk that you can change, but that stays there. And I did the standing thing for like a month, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. I can't stand this long. I need to go back to sitting. And I've gone. So now I have 2 desks actually, and I just move from one to the other when I need to. But I need to get one of the ones that is motorized.
I'd say the other thing is invest in a really good padded carpet or mat. Because that was the other game changers, like having that and being able to stand on something that's cushioned, way better.
Question number 2. Would you rather have to wear bell-bottom pants all the time or have your hair in a mohawk?
Oh, man. I guess I'd rather have to have a mohawk.
Interesting.
I just don't think I could do bell-bottoms. Yeah.
I would go for the mohawk just so I could have some hair.
Well, yeah, that's probably where I am too.
Question number 3. Would you rather have the ability to see 10 minutes into the future or 10 years into the future?
I think 10 minutes. I'm not sure that I want to know what's going to happen 10 years from now. I mean, there could be benefit, but it also strikes me that I probably just don't want that much information.
That would carry a lot with it. Interesting. Okay, next question. What is your favorite meal?
My wife makes an amazing prime rib roast, so that's probably number 1. But a close number 2 would be Carnitas street tacos in Southern California.
Oh, awesome.
That sounds good. Next question. Do you have a hidden talent?
I don't think so.
That's a good
answer. The world is aware of all your talent.
That's right.
Or my lack thereof, I guess.
I'm anxious to ask that question sometime and have someone, they can play music with their hand in their armpit or something like that. That's got to happen.
Out of their nose or something, yeah.
Okay, next to last question. Do you consider yourself to be a morning person or more of a night owl?
I am 100% a morning person. I get up at about 4:30 in the morning, and I do my best at whatever I need to do for the day between like 4:30 in the morning and 10 in the morning. And then by like 4 o'clock, I'm done.
That describes me to a T, except it's about 2 o'clock when I feel toast.
Okay.
Does part of that have to do with being on a farm and having farm responsibilities that need to be taken care of in the morning?
It's certainly a benefit with that, but this started for me when I was in college.
Okay, final question. Who is one person who has had a big impact on your life and how?
That would be my friend and mentor, a gentleman named Todd Bray. He's the executive director of a group called Downrange Warriors, and they are a suicide prevention program for veterans. During college, when I was going through all this stuff with my family, his son was my college roommate, and I nearly walked away from my faith, and it was through his mentorship that I was able to regain that. So he'd be the one.
I knew you'd have a good answer to that because behind every impactful person, there are more impactful people.
Amen.
No doubt about it. Good stuff. Well, Andrew, thank you again. For folks who want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, easiest way is probably LinkedIn, Andrew Olsen. But if somebody wants to get in touch directly, they can get me at andrew@andrewolsen.net, and my cell is 612-201-1967.
Great, thank you. And I want to give another shout out to, you'd mentioned earlier, Salvation Army and the work that they do with addictions and support. And I'm right there with you. Good organization that
Absolutely
does a lot more than what most people think it does.
Oh my goodness, yeah, it's shocking how much work they do.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. This has been great. Great time with you always, and thank you for sharing very personal story with us.
Thanks again for creating a platform for this kind of conversation. Really appreciate it, guys.
Well, and I want to thank our audience for tuning into this episode of Construction Disruption with Andrew Olsen of Dickerson-Bakker. Please watch for future episodes of our show. We're always blessed with great guests. Don't forget to leave a review, please, on Apple Podcasts or YouTube. Until the next time we're together, keep on disrupting, keep on challenging, keep on looking for ways that you can help and impact others and have positive impact on their lives. So thanks again so much for tuning in. This is Isaiah Industries, signing off until the next episode of Construction Disruption.
This podcast is produced by Isaiah Industries, manufacturer of specialty metal roofing and other building products.